Is we are live on YouTube and let let me start the recording as well. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Beyond the Myth 2.0. It is a history workshop that we started last year with the aim of promoting academic history among the masses. Is we are live on YouTube. I was hearing my own echo. Sorry for that. But as I was saying, this is a workshop that aims to make academic history accessible to a largely non-history audience, maybe we can say, who are not professional history students. And because sometimes what happens is academic history remains within academic circles, so we tried doing this publicly so that others can also benefit from different perspectives. There are many ways one can look at this workshop. One is through this online thing, but the other is it is a stand against the distortions of Indian history that has been going on for many years now. The changes in the NCRT books, the overflow of WhatsApp history messages on social media, which is now passing down as history. This is our resistance against the distortions that has been going on. And in the series of the guest lectures and lectures by Caravan team, today we have a mentor who is with us since the beginning of Caravan, almost 6 years. And I met him through his book called Early Social Formations. This is the 15th edition. When I was student, that was when the 15th edition was out. Now it is in its 23rd, 24th, or I think 25th edition. And this is popularly known as the Bible for history students in Delhi University. This is the most difficult subject, but the most lucid, most comprehensible book that you can read on what we call SOFO, social formation. So this was my introduction to Professor Farooqui. But later on, I was also introduced to his pioneering work on smuggling as subversion, on opium trade, especially in central India, Malwa provinces. And this was Colonialism, Indian Merchants, and the Politics of Opium, which was published many years ago by New Age international publishers. It is still available for those who want to understand the trade of opium and the politics of opium. The other book that remains bestsellers for everybody who wants to understand Delhi's history, especially around the revolt, is Zafar and the Raj. This was published by Primus and has remained one of the most important books to understand Anglo-Mughal Delhi from 1800 to 1850. And after that, most recently, Professor Farooqui also wrote this very important public facing scholarship called The Colonial Subjugation of India, which came out last year, if I'm not mistaken, from Aleph Book Company. And he's working on many more books now, which we await. Hopefully, we'll get to read that book this year in the end or next year sometime. But he is an expert, a pioneer in colonial history, modern Indian history, history of opium, history of Malwa. Sindhya and the Raj is one of those books that one can't stop reading. His work on Bombay and the making of the colonial Bombay is one of those books that everybody reads when one starts thinking about how Bombay was shaped during early colonial time when it was passed down from the Portuguese to the British. But in today's lecture, Professor Farooqui is going to talk about the British East India Company and its empire. So, without further ado, thank you so much, Amar sir, for accepting this invitation as always. Over to you. I'll see you after the lecture for the conversation. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ishan. As always, your introductions are so uh, generous. And I am thankful to Karma for giving me this opportunity once again to share some of what I have to say on the subject of the East India Company, colonialism, empire. And I'm always sort of, uh, I feel privileged always to be part of this journey of Karava, which began almost 6 years ago. Now, the theme of today's lecture, of our discussion today, will be the East India Company and its empire. So, I have I thought that I'll use this title because I did want to emphasize the role of the East India Company in creating Britain's colonial empire, which, as all of you know, India was such an important component of that colonial empire. And I also wanted to underline this uh, peculiar sort of feature of this empire, that it is an empire of the company. And this remained an empire of the company till 1858. We'll see how it functioned. And but broadly speaking, when we talk about this empire, इसके तीन चार महत्वपूर्ण चरण हैं इस इतिहास के. 1600, the company is formed, as many of you might know, or rather, it is sort of given a privileged a charter which gives it a privileged position in the trade between Britain, England, and Asia. And for over 150 years, it is engaged in trade, but it is also engaged in many other things. We'll talk about those things, those activities of the East India Company. और फिर 1757 में प्लासी के युद्ध के बाद उसको इतना बड़ा क्षेत्र भारत के उपमहाद्वीप का मिल जाता है जिसके ऊपर उसका शासन स्थापित हो जाता है. So acquiring such large territory itself changed and transformed the character of the East India Company very substantially. And it also altered its relationship, जो उसका रिश्ता था ब्रिटिश राज्य से, वहां की जो सत्ताधारी जो वर्ग थे उनसे जो उनका रिश्ता था, वो बहुत उसका पूरा जो चरित्र है वो परिवर्तित हो जाता है. So we'll talk about that also, and how these changes then get reflected in legislation in Britain. And then there is there is this phase of till 1813 when it is expanding its empire, but after 1813 it no longer has a monopoly of trade with India. और 1813 और 1858 के बीच जो ब्रिटिश राज्य है उसका नियंत्रण ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के ऊपर लगातार बढ़ता जाता है. लेकिन ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी का अस्तित्व समाप्त नहीं हुआ है. इट्स स्टिल देयर. और उसका जो उसकी जो भूमिका है भारत पर शासन करने की, साम्राज्य पर शासन करने की, वो भूमिका पूरी तरह से समाप्त नहीं होती है, परिवर्तित हो जाती है. उसका चरित्र परिवर्तित हो जाता है, लेकिन वो पूरी तरह से समाप्त नहीं होती. उसके बारे में भी हम थोड़ी सी चर्चा करेंगे. और फिर 1857 के बाद 1858 में there's a lot of pressure in Britain that now the company's rule must come to an end. It has mismanaged the empire so badly that it must go. And that is what leads eventually to the crown taking over in 1858. But the company doesn't end, its history doesn't end in 1858. It has still survives for another roughly 15 years. And I'll say a few words towards the end, few words on that as well. So what we are going to look at is a long historical process whereby the company created an empire, and gradually there is a sharing of power between the company and the British state. and components of the British state in a very sort of this itself this relationship itself is an evolving relationship. तो मैं 1600 से शुरू करता हूं. So 1600, the company gets a charter, and I'll come to that charter in a moment. But before that, let me just make 2 points. One is that England is still a fairly, it's not, I mean, it's an economy in the 16th century. Late 16th century is not a very advanced economy. There are changes, but those changes will become visible and their impact will become important a little later on in the 17th century and more so in the 18th century. But there is one feature which I do want to highlight in the context of the East India Company. I'm not going to go into the details of the economy and so on or politics of Britain. तो इस समय ट्यूडर डायनेस्टी का इंग्लैंड पर शासन. By the way, please remember, this is something we tend to forget, that England is at this time England, which means Scotland is not yet a part of England. Scotland, the union between Scotland and England took place in 1707. So for over 100 years of this history, we are talking of England. Of course, England includes Wales as well, क्योंकि Wales और England का जो union है वो इससे पहले हो चुका था. So Scotland would become part of England, Britain a little later on. So we are not talking of Britain, we are talking of England. And the Tudor dynasty is ruling over England at this time. Very well-known ruler of that dynasty was Henry VIII, and his break with Rome and then the emergence of Protestantism, वो पूरा इतिहास है Tudor dynasty का. But the time that we are talking about, it is Elizabeth I, who ruled from the 1550s to 1603, who is the Queen of England. और उसके समय में एक महत्वपूर्ण development हुआ था, and that was a conflict with Spain. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that conflict, but there is one important point I want to make. That it is during the course of that conflict, this is known as the Anglo-Spanish War, which began in 1585 and ended just around the time, just a little after Elizabeth's death in 1604. So for these roughly 20 years, England is at war with Spain. And this is a war which is waged on the sea. England has, of course, Spain has its empire in America. Spain has a very powerful fleet of ships, armed ships, but England, although it has a very small navy, still has developed ships which are very effective on the sea, well armed, effective, fast. लेकिन वो इतनी संख्या में नहीं है कि स्पेन को चैलेंज कर सके. तो Elizabeth and her sort of court, what they do is they encourage private shippers to engage in raids and plunder on Spanish shipping. ये चीज जानना, इस चीज पर थोड़ा सा जोर देना आवश्यक इसलिए है क्योंकि ये प्रश्न हमारे सामने है. अचानक क्या हुआ कि इंग्लैंड is making these long voyages from England across the Atlantic, then into the Indian Ocean, then to India, beyond that to Indonesia, to the South China Sea. Just think of that distance. Suddenly, what happened that they are able to have developed shipping of that kind. ऐसे ships होने चाहिए, ऐसे सेलर्स होने चाहिए, ऐसे जहाजों के कप्तान होने चाहिए जो इस प्रकार, और ऐसे जहाज जो इतनी लंबी वॉयज कर सके इन 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 समुद्री मार्गों की जानकारी होनी चाहिए. How did all this, how was all this acquired? This, and it is in that context that I just want to, I'm not going to go into detail. I just want you to keep in mind that the Spanish American War is what provided the experience to these sailors, these captains, these navigators, and the confidence, they acquired that confidence to make long transoceanic voyages. तो अटलांटिक में स्पेनिश शिप्स के ऊपर हमला करने से, क्योंकि दे आर बीइंग एनकरेज टू डू दिस बाय द इंग्लिश कोर्ट, बाय द इंग्लिश ऑफिशियल्स, इन पर हमला करो और इनको लूटो और प्लंडर करो. और प्लंडर में एक चीज, एक एक्सपीरियंस, एक चीज और भी थी उनके लिए बहुत जो अट्रैक्टिव थी. द स्पेनिश शिप्स यूज्ड टू ब्रिंग ए लॉट ऑफ ट्रेजर फ्रॉम अमेरिका टू स्पेन. जो सोना और चांदी जो अमेरिका की लूट थी, जो मेक्सिको की, साउथ अमेरिका की जो लूट थी, उसको भी रेगुलरली लेकर आते थे. तो उनको प्लंडर करना उनके लिए बहुत अट्रैक्टिव था. सो दिस वाज द इंसेंटिव आल्सो दैट दे ऑफन हैड. नाउ दिस इज व्हाट provided a great deal of experience to these to these navigators, sailors, to undertake these long voyages. And it is not surprising that some of these people were actually among the group which was trying to organize a company which would then request the queen to give them a special charter. तो 1600 में ये उनको चार्टर मिल जाता है. और इस कंपनी में जो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी, और दीज आर ऑल लंडन बेस्ड मर्चेंट्स, they have connections with the royal court, but they also are people who have gained a lot of experience in this Spanish American War, in plundering ships, in looting these ships. These are called privateers. That's the official term that is used, privateers. So English privateering was sort of officially sanctioned piracy. Let me put it that. Privateering was actually officially sanctioned, because this was officially sanctioned by the British government, and sanctioned piracy on the high seas. So this provided them with that experience. But there are other factors also, which of course I'm not going to go into, but I just want to sort of underline this, because we need to understand how it was that the East India Company was able to find ships, they were able to find navigators, they were able to find captains who would lead fleets into this on this long transoceanic voyage. Now, before I go further, there is one other feature of this trade which needs to be mentioned. And I'd spend a couple of minutes on that, because without that, a lot of this will not make sense. I'll come back to the East India Company, the charter that it received in 1600. But before that, there's something else I want to refer to. So I want to go back a little to Vasco da Gama's voyage to the Indian Ocean and back. So 1498 में Vasco da Gama, as many of you would know, reached the west coast of India, the Malabar coast. इस को discovery कहा जाता है. There was no discovery in this, because the route along which he traveled was a well-known route, and India didn't have to be discovered. The Indian Ocean didn't have to be discovered. It was well known. But what this journey did was it showed that the a new route from Europe to Asia was a workable route. इस रास्ते से आना जाना संभव है। और वो क्या रूट था? वो रूट था दक्षिण अफ्रीका होते हुए along the southern coast of Africa, the continent of Africa, वहां से होते हुए केप ऑफ गुड होप को पार करके इंडियन ओशन आना। तो इस रूट का मतलब था कि पुर्तगाल से, लिस्बन से अटलांटिक कोस्ट अफ्रीका की पूरी क्रॉस करके अलोंग द वेस्ट कोस्ट ऑफ अफ्रीका, एंड देन द सदर्न कोस्ट ऑफ अफ्रीका, एंड देन इनटू द इंडियन ओशन, across the Arabian Sea to the west coast of India. That was the route, and then back along this whole route. This वास्को ड गामा डिमॉन्स्ट्रेटेड कि इस रूट से आना जाना संभव है। क्यों डिमॉन्स्ट्रेट करने की बात इस समय इतनी महत्वपूर्ण थी? क्योंकि इससे पहले जो रूट एक्टिव था व्यापार के लिए, वैसे भी आने जाने के लिए, जो एक्सप्लोरर्स आदि थे उनका, वो था पार्टली लैंड पार्टली सी रूट। मेडिटेरेनियन सी, देन ईस्टर्न मेडिटेरेनियन, वेस्ट एशिया, और वेस्ट एशिया से फिर इट कुड गो आइदर द पर्शियन गल्फ, द रेड सी, और ओवरलैंड टू इंडिया, टू चाइना एंड बियॉन्ड। So this was the traditional route. But what Vasco da Gama and Portuguese voyages did was to demonstrate that a new all-sea route via the Cape of Good Hope was possible. And that is why Vasco da Gama's journey is considered to be important. So Vasco da Gama returns to Lisbon, having and demonstrates that this route is workable. And after that, there are several fleets then which keep regularly coming to the Indian Ocean, and the Portuguese gradually take over the all sea, establish a monopoly over the all sea route between Europe and Asia via the Cape of Good Hope. लेकिन मोनोपोली जब आप एस्टैब्लिश करेंगे तो उसमें एक चीज का ध्यान रखना पड़ता है कि there will be others who can challenge your monopoly. And if you have to establish a monopoly, then it involves force, violence. तो इसके लिए यह आवश्यक था कि पुर्तगाल के पास इस प्रकार के जहाज होते जिसमें guns, cannons could be deployed. ऐसे नाविक होते, ऐसे सेलर्स होते who could also be soldiers, who could so the ships were not mere merchant ships. Textbooks don't tell us this part of textbooks के लिए these are sort of just traders who are moving between Europe and Asia. But please do remember that these are armed fleets, heavily armed fleets. And it is with these fleets that they come to the Indian Ocean, bringing a new element to the trade of the Indian Ocean, which is violence. So these are not just merchant ships. And it is with that violence that they enforce the monopoly. For nearly 1 century, the Portuguese control this route, that is the all-sea route between Europe and Asia via the Cape of Good Hope. What else they do in Asia, I'm not going to go into that aspect. But I just want to underline their monopoly and the use of violence to establish that monopoly. अगर उस मोनोपोली को तोड़ना था तो even greater violence had to be used. So towards the end of the 16th century, other merchants, traders in other parts of Europe also were looking for this opportunity, and they could only challenge the Portuguese monopoly by using more force, greater force, greater violence. Now, by the end of the 16th century, there are competitors. And one important competitor was Holland, Netherlands. So the Dutch traders who also wanted to get into this trade, they had to mobilize themselves. And please keep in mind that it is very expensive to put together this fleet. इसके लिए पूंजी चाहिए, इसके लिए नाविक चाहिए, और इस प्रकार के इन्वेस्टर चाहिए जो 3, 4, 5 साल तक इंतजार कर सकें कि उनको अपने इन्वेस्टमेंट पर रिटर्न मिलेगा, और वो ये रिस्क लेने को भी तैयार हो कि अगर उनका जो इन्वेस्टमेंट है वो डूब जाता है तो उसको सस्टेन करने की उनमें क्षमता होनी चाहिए. So the Dutch economy was able to provide that kind of an environment, that kind of an infrastructure in which it became possible for traders in the Netherlands to put together large fleets. और ये फ्लीट्स इस प्रकार की होनी चाहिए, जहाज इस प्रकार के होने चाहिए जो और अधिक वायलेंस में एंगेज कर सके. So they were able to, and Portugal was a relatively backward economy, and a lot of the the commodities that, and I'm going to refer to commodities in a moment, a lot of the commodities that they brought from Asia were actually distributed in Europe by traders based in Central Europe, in what became Germany, or in Netherlands. And in fact, Amsterdam emerged as the financial capital of Europe. So actually it was these distributors, these financiers who were making a lot of profits also out of the Portuguese trade. Now, by the end of the 16th century, the Portuguese monopoly was being challenged by the Dutch traders. और 1602 में, 1602, एक डच ट्रेडर्स ने एक कंपनी बनाई, द डच ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी. उसके जो डच भाषा में उसका जो एब्रिविएशन है वो VOC है. तो 1602 में ईस्ट इंडिया इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी 1600 में स्थापित हुई, लेकिन उसकी इतनी क्षमता नहीं थी कि वो पुर्तगाल की मोनोपोली को चैलेंज कर सके. डच कंपनी में वो क्षमता थी, वो इतने बड़े इतनी पूंजी एकत्रित कर सकते थे कि वो बड़े जहाज खरीद सके, उनको गन्स से इक्विप कर सके, नाविकों से उनके नाविकों को रिक्रूट कर सके, और इतने लंबे ट्रांस ओशियानिक वॉयजेस पर उनको भेज सकें, और वो उन रिटर्न्स का अगर उसमें नुकसान भी हो जाता है तो उसको भी झेल सके, और उसके लिए 3, 4 साल इंतजार भी कर सके. So it was the Dutch East India Company which then posed the really big challenge to the Portuguese by the beginning of around 1600. So between 1600 and let us say the 1620s, the Dutch East India Company and the Portuguese are actually engaged in a fierce conflict for control over this route. The Dutch are successful. And for the next century, that is 17th century, they dominate, they control this trade, the trade along the all sea route via the Cape of Good Hope. Now, what is it that these ships are coming for? These ships are coming for spices. What spices? Pepper, kali mirch, cloves, long, and a very rare spice, nutmeg and mace. जायफल उत्तरी भारत में, विशेषकर हिंदी बोलने वाले क्षेत्रों में उसको जायफल और जावित्री कहते हैं, और भाषाओं में उसकी और नाम भी हैं. It's a very rare spice. It used to be a very rare spice, just grown in one particular small group of islands, which are part today of Indonesia. And these which produced nutmeg, and nutmeg की ही outer covering होती है actually. The membrane of the nutmeg is actually what is known as javitri or mace. So these were the spices which they were carrying, which they came for, and which they were carrying back to Europe. Pepper is fairly widely grown in parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia. तो उसको कई जगह से प्रोक्योर किया जाता था. Cloves, that is long, was confined to a very small area. Its production, what were known as the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, वहीं पर ये ग्रो होते थे. और फिर जैसा मैंने बताया कि nutmeg and mace was just a tiny small group of islands, the Banda Islands, where this was grown. Unlike the Portuguese, what the Dutch did, they established territorial control over many of these locations where these spices were grown. यहां तक के places like Banda Islands, they completely killed the entire local population. उनको मार ही डाला सब. अपना कंट्रोल स्थापित करने के लिए, so that they become monopoly suppliers to Europe. मोनोपोली होगी तो सुपर प्रॉफिट्स होंगे. 400%, 500%, 1000%. That's the level at which they were earning profits. Pepper, of course, was also expensive, but then it has grown fairly widely, including on the Malabar coast in Kerala and in other parts of Southeast Asia. So what the Dutch are trying to do is to control as much as possible production areas, and they established territorial control. Portuguese also had their sort of colonies, but these were relatively small outposts along the coastline, जहां से वो ट्रेड को रेगुलेट कंट्रोल करने की कोशिश करते थे. But the Dutch brought a new element: more violence, territorial control, colonies, large colonies. Eventually, the whole of Indonesia became a Dutch colony. यहां तक कि उन्होंने तो साउथ अफ्रीका को भी अपनी कॉलोनी बना लिया. What I mean, there was no South Africa at that time, but what grew into the Cape Colony, which is the settlement around Cape Town, was developed by the Dutch as a halting station. साउथ अफ्रीका में रेसिज्म का, अपार्थाइड का जो पूरा इतिहास है, उसकी जो जड़ें हैं, उसकी जो रूट्स हैं, वो डच ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी की इस रिक्वायरमेंट में है कि जब यूरोप से एशिया उनके जहाज जा रहे हैं, उनको कोई हॉल्टिंग स्टेशन चाहिए on this long journey where they can stop, where they can pick up some further supplies, where they can be repaired, where they can replenish their supplies of water. तो केप टाउन उन्होंने अपना बेस बनाया, केप टाउन से उसके आसपास का सेटलमेंट करा, उस वहां से पूरा केप को डेवलप करके और उसको अपने अधीन करा, एंड इन द प्रोसेस दे सब्जुगेटेड द अफ्रीकन पीपल of that entire region. I mean, we sometimes tend to forget these histories. So the people of South Africa, what became South Africa, became subjects of colonial rule because initially the Dutch East India Company needed a halting station on its long journey from Amsterdam to Indonesia. So, I mean, so this way of establishing control is something, large territorial control is something that the Dutch brought into the Indian Ocean and, of course, in southern Africa. Establishing control over supplies, thereby, as in the case of the Banda Islands, unki puri population ko they decimated the entire population. So this is how they then managed to procure spices, not by going to a market. आप जाकर, और ये जो ट्रेड की कहानी है ना टेक्स्ट बुक्स की, वो ट्रेडर थे, ट्रेड के लिए जाते थे, वहां पर खरीदते थे, फिर यूरोप ले जाते थे, क्योंकि उन्होंने बहुत अपना उसमें इन्वेस्टमेंट करा था, इसलिए जाकर, और वो वहां पर और वो मेहनत करी थी, इसलिए वो थोड़ा मुनाफा कमा लेते थे, वो कहानी नहीं है. So we need to keep these stories also in mind. Of course, there were places where they could not establish complete territorial control. That's why they were not able to fully control supplies, particularly of pepper, which was the major commodity in demand in Europe. But they did do all these things. That's what, and all this required lots of violence. So these were violent traders. They brought, they came with armed ships. हथियारों से लैस जहाज थे, very powerful guns. So the English East India Company, to come back now. So 17th century is actually dominated by the Dutch. 16th by the 16th century, 1500 से लगभग 1600 तक पोर्चुगीज, 1600 से लगभग 1700 तक Dutch. Just to as a sort of as a simple kind of formula. But by the end of the 17th century, by about the 1680s, 1690s, the English East India Company has become sufficiently powerful to challenge the Dutch East India Company. Dutch main focus is in Southeast Asia, mainly Indonesia and the Indonesian islands. They also acquire some territory in Ceylon. They also acquire some territory in Malabar. Also, they have outposts on the Tamil Nadu coast or the Coromandel coast. So all that is there. They also have a presence in Bengal. But large territorial control is Indonesia. Indonesia remained a Dutch colony. Because we'll come to these questions, but the point is that, there was a resistance, of course, in Indonesia also. Please remember this. It's not as though they came and then people just said that आ जाइए और आप हमारे मेहमान हैं और यहाँ पे रहिए. It's not like that. They actually resisted. So much so that what is today Jakarta was completely destroyed. And they eventually rebuilt it, and then that became their capital of Batavia. They renamed it also, and so there was a resistance there as well. बांदा में भी जो उन्होंने करा उस छोटे से ग्रुप ऑफ आइलैंड्स पे, तो वो इसलिए करा क्योंकि रेजिस्टेंस था, वहां के लोगों को खत्म कर दिया, because they were not in that position to sort of resist very forcefully. But in the Indian subcontinent, they were confronted with powerful political entities. And that made it difficult for them to behave in the same way as they had behaved in parts of Southeast Asia. That's why they also, in Japan, they had a very difficult time. In China, they were not able to penetrate very easily. In Japan, they were just confined to one small out place near Nagasaki. So, wherever the sort of political entities were powerful to resist successfully, whether it is in India, whether it is the Mughals, whether it is whether it is Vijayanagar, whether later on Golconda, whether it is on the Kerala coast, they were not able to do whatever they wanted. Yeah. It's not as though they didn't use violence. They tried violence. I mean, even if one was to go back to Vasco da Gama's first voyage itself, he unleashed a lot of violence on the Kerala, on the Malabar coast. That's a well documented story. So, this is because people were not willing to sell at the prices they wanted to buy. So, हम violence use करके छीन लेंगे. That was the way in which the Portuguese, the Dutch operate. Now, the reason I went into all this detail is to sort of draw your attention to two things. One, that the English East India Company, even though it was formed 2 years before the Dutch company, did not have the resources. उसके पास इतने साधन ही नहीं थे कि वो they could sort of take on the Dutch East India Company. And before that, also the Dutch, they could not have taken on the Portuguese till the Dutch economy it became strong enough for them to be able to challenge the Portuguese monopoly. But by the end of the 17th century, by about, let's say, the 1680s, 1690s, Dutch East India Company is facing problems. They are facing a challenge from the English. लेकिन एक और competitor भी आ गया है. That is the French East India Company. That's also that becomes a fairly powerful competitor. French East India Company was formed much later. English East India Company, 1600. Dutch East India Company, 1602. French East India Company, 1664. And by the end of the 17th century, in fact, both the Dutch as well as the French as well as the English are in a position to challenge the Dutch East India Company. I will not again go into details, but Dutch control has declined by the beginning of the 18th century. अब मैदान में कौन रह गए? French or English East India Company. So the first part of the 18th century is actually dominated. When you're looking at the history of colonialism in Asia, the first part of the 18th century is dominated by a conflict between the English and the French. And this conflict is taking place largely initially in southern India. Why southern India is suddenly so important? I'm not going to, we can take up some of these things when we have a discussion later on. But I just want to point out to you that among the important reasons is that, first of all, the English were not able to penetrate Southeast Asia because of Dutch control. So they focused a lot of their activities in India. That's also the case with the French. They focused their activities on the Indian subcontinent. लेकिन एक और चीज भी हुई है, यूरोप में जो डिमांड है ना मार्केट्स में, वो भी शिफ्ट हुई है फ्रॉम स्पाइसेस being important to gradually textiles becoming more important. So this is something they are procuring from Indian markets, from Gujarat, from the Coromandel. This is where, from Tamil Nadu, this is Bengal. This is where they are beginning to focus a lot of their activities. So this becomes the focus of their activities. And by the beginning of the 18th century, the French and the English East India Company are engaged in a bitter conflict to dominate over the trade between Europe and India. So now it's more specifically India. So trade between Europe and India, with textiles becoming a very important component, cotton textiles in particular. Also, they are taking raw silk. So this becomes an important focus of their activity. And a lot of this rivalry is being played out in southern India, particularly along the Coromandel coast, what is today Tamil Nadu, but also a little northwards towards Andhra. This is the area in which their conflict becomes very, very sharp, leading eventually to the three Anglo-French wars. I will not go into the details. And these wars actually overlap with another series of wars, which are actually sort of which are sort of these wars are perpetuated precisely because these companies are engaged in this conflict. So they are using Indian sort of political entities in India for fighting for against each other as well. These are what are known as the Carnatic Wars. Carnatic Wars are wars, Carnatic spelled with a C, are wars which are actually taking place in what is present day Tamil Nadu mainly, but then there are other parts which are drawn in. There is, it spreads to parts of what is present day Karnataka, Telangana, Andhra, Kerala, sort of engulfs a large part of this entire region. Eventually, during the course of these wars, what happens is that the English East India Company is able to get the upper hand because of the Battle of Plassey in 1757. It is happening actually during the course of an Anglo-French war. और वो चलती है वो war till 1763, which is the result of wars they are fighting in Europe, wars they are fighting in America. They have colonial conflicts in America also. लेकिन इंडिया में the issue is settled with the Battle of Plassey. क्योंकि प्लासी से जो रिसोर्सेज ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को मिल गए, इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को, उन रिसोर्सेज का मुकाबला फ्रेंच कर ही नहीं सकते थे. And that put an end to the French attempts to establish a large empire in India. By the early 1760s, the French project of an empire in India is gone, precisely because Plassey has happened. Now, let me just give you a little background to Plassey. So, I will not go into the details of Plassey at all. But since this is such an important historical moment, I do want to say one or two things over here. So, Plassey का मतलब था कि ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को बंगाल, बिहार और उड़ीसा का कुछ हिस्सा, क्योंकि उड़ीसा का अभी बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा 1803 तक मराठा कंट्रोल में था. 1803 के बाद ही इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के कंट्रोल में आया, उनके अधीन आया हुआ. लेकिन बंगाल एंड बिहार, both of them Mughal subas, we are referring to the Mughal subas of Bihar and Bengal. They came under the control of the East India Company after 1757. That is the so-called Battle of Plassey. It's a so-called battle because it wasn't really a battle. Nothing really happened. Nothing really happened because the East India Company had already bought important figures in the Bengal aristocracy, which ensured that no battle would actually take place. So nothing much really happened. This is not one of the great battles. In historical consequences, it's important, but it's not one of the great battles of, if you're looking at military history, it's not much of a battle. क्योंकि अधिकतर फौज तो लड़ी ही नहीं, उनसे कह दिया गया था कि एक तरफ खड़े रहना. क्योंकि ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी ने पहले ही अपना जो फैक्शनल अलाइनमेंट्स हैं वो इस प्रकार के कर लिए थे कि बंगाल की एरिस्टोक्रेसी का एक बड़ा हिस्सा उन्होंने, या यूं कहना चाहिए बड़ा हिस्से कहने के बजाय मैं कहूंगा एक इन्फ्लुएंशियल हिस्सा, जो जिसका वहां पर पॉलिटिकल वर्चस्व था, उसका एक बड़ा हिस्सा, उस हिस्से इन्फ्लुएंशियल हिस्से को अपने तरफ कर लिया, अपने साथ मिला लिया। Now, the Battle of Plassey is sort of well recorded. Any textbook will tell you about its details. There's something else I want to say over here, which is important for an understanding of the East India Company. These 150 years that the East India Company has been active so far, we need to understand this historical process. So what is this? ये क्या ऐतिहासिक प्रक्रिया है जिससे प्लासी हुआ? वो 150 साल का जो इतिहास है ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी का, उसमें वो क्या कर रहे हैं? क्या केवल व्यापार कर रहे हैं? Which is what textbooks would tell us. If we have, if if we have been looking at the Portuguese and the Dutch, what they have been doing, then it's very clear कि व्यापार के साथ साथ वो राजनीति भी कर रहे हैं, वो डिप्लोमेसी भी कर रहे हैं, उनका मिलिट्री इंटरवेंशन भी है, वो इन सब क्षेत्रों में बहुत सक्रिय है, राजनीति में, डिप्लोमेसी में भी, और मिलिट्री हस्तक्षेप में, इन सब में बहुत सक्रिय है। दे आर बिल्डिंग अलायंसेस, दे आर एंगेज्ड इन लोकल पॉलिटिक्स, रीजनल पॉलिटिक्स, विभिन्न जो दरबार हैं उनमें वो पेनिट्रेट कर रहे हैं, वहां की राजनीति समझ रहे हैं। केवल वही नहीं, भारतीय समाज में भी अपने आप को स्थापित करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। किस प्रकार? एक आपको मैं उदाहरण दूंगा। अगर आप क्लाइव के बारे में डॉक्यूमेंट्स आप देखें, पर्टिकुलरली the documents generated by Indian courts and rulers, Mughals, or in South India or in Bengal, so there is no person by the name of Clive in those records. But there is a person who is very important, who is becoming very important, who is known by the title of Nawab Sabit Jung. Somebody who has proved himself in war. It's a title. It's a Mughal title. He's known actually by a Mughal title. Why is that title so important? Why is he known by that title? Clive himself is keen to get that title. He wants that recognition. Why? Not because he has great sort of respect for the Mughal emperor. No. It's because it makes him recognizable by Indian elites. They're able to place him in that hierarchy. They're able to figure out that this is an important person. In other words, people like Clive tried to embed themselves in Indian society by using all these elements which were important to Indian elites. So Indian elites realize their great significance, and they are known by those titles, they are known by those names to Indian elites. So what matters to them is the Indian elites, and they have to embed themselves socially for that purpose. And the Mughal title, a royal title from the imperial court, was an important way of doing it. It was one of the important devices for indicating somebody's place in the hierarchy. I'll come to another point. I'll come to the Diwani in a moment. But quickly, let me say that what happened in Bengal was that Bengal, by the beginning of the 18th century, I mean, by the 1720s, 1730s, although it is a part of the Mughal Empire, it has become more or less autonomous. Nevertheless, the Subedar of Bengal, who gradually is also known as the Nawab of Bengal, also another title, the Nazim. These are titles by which they are known, they are familiar in the Mughal hierarchy. In the imperial system, the Mughal Subedar does not repudiate his loyalty to the Mughal emperor. Formally, all sort of the protocols of the Mughal court are followed. All the paperwork is strictly adhered to. I'll come to that in a moment. That's also what people like Clive are doing. They adhere to that protocol when they are dealing with the Mughals, when they are dealing with the Subedar and the Subedar's court, because at this time, please remember that the court, the Mughal capital had been for quite some time at Dhaka. It later shifted to Murshidabad. That's the time of Murshid Quli Khan. Subsequently, another Mughal official became very important, namely Alivardi Khan, who died in 1756, and his successor, Sirajud-Dowla, is the person who then got into this sort of conflict with the East India Company leading up to the Battle of Plassey. The point I'm trying to make is that the East India Company is part of the politics of the Murshidabad Darbar. They're part of that. The East India Company has been in Bengal since the early part of the 17th century. 1650s में उन्होंने एक फैक्ट्री स्थापित करी at Hooghly. Then they gradually, by the end of the 17th century, took over those villages, the Talukdari, which means the right to collect revenue. They became revenue collectors in the Mughal system for the villages, which then developed into Calcutta. This is where they built Fort William, and the settlement around there, that is what became Calcutta. So they were initially revenue functionaries in the Mughal imperial system as talukdars. There's a very wrong impression which many times is given again in standard textbooks, that they acquired these territories where they built Fort William. No, they only acquired the revenue collecting rights in this territory and share, whatever the traditional share to the produce was as talukdars. So the company already is part of that system. It's trying to become part of the system. It's part actually of the revenue collecting apparatus in Bengal. And they have also managed to penetrate the Murshidabad Darbar. In fact, their when I say factory का मतलब है गोदाम, दफ्तर और रहने की जो उनके रेजिडेंशियल क्वार्टर्स हैं कंपनी वालों के, वो टुगेदर दैट वाज द फैक्ट्री. And the Mughals actually never allowed in many other parts of the subcontinent, other rulers also, they didn't allow, for instance, the Golconda rulers didn't allow them to fortify these factories. A lot of the conflict initially at Calcutta, which led to Plassey, began actually with unauthorized fortifications of Fort William, of their factory. So this Surat, they were not allowed. Surat, again, the English East India Company has a presence in Surat since 1613. They have a factory over there. The Mughals gave them permission to set up a factory, but they could not fortify it. They could not buy land. They had to rent it. So the Mughals were very particular about this, and others also, like Golconda, also, the Vijayanagar or the remnants of Vijayanagar, they weren't ceding their sovereignty to these to the companies over land where they built their factories. No, they were given some rights which are very clearly defined in documents. So the company is becoming a part of the politics at the मुर्शिदाबाद दरबार. और मुर्शिदाबाद के बराबर में उनकी सबसे बड़ी फैक्ट्री भी है कासिम बाजार में. कासिम बाजार नियर मुर्शिदाबाद इज वेयर दे हैव देयर बिगेस्ट फैक्ट्री. कलकत्ता तो अभी बहुत दूर है. कलकत्ता में बहुत ज्यादा व्यापार इतना नहीं है. So this is where they are active. They are active in the politics, the factionalism at the Darbar. I will not go into the details of that, except then to come to the point that they are not there merely as traders, innocent traders, who then have to defend themselves. और क्योंकि उनको समस्या हो रही हैं, इसलिए वो जो है उन लोगों के साथ देने लगते हैं कि जो who are interested in overthrowing Siraj-ud-Dawla. No, they themselves, the plot actually originates with people like Clive. The conspiracy begins with Clive. And this has to do with trade. This has to do with also establishing a presence where they can have fortifications, an armed presence. And that leads to the resistance, which अभी एक प्रश्न था कि वहां पे मना वो अंत में क्या हुआ. अंत में it became a military confrontation which was Plassey, which again they are able to win. Why? Because they've already, through factional alignments in the Darbar, they've already managed to ensure they will have support, and a large part of the army will not be active in what is going to happen in the battle itself. So then when what the outcome is, of course, well known. So Siraj-ud-Dawla had to leave. He was eventually captured, killed, and Mir Jafar was put in place. I will not go into the details again of that history. It's there in a large number of textbooks. But I want to then come to, again, this resistance. So let us remember that it is the elites in India have not yet. अभी उन्हें पता नहीं है कि ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी बहुत बड़ा एम्पायर बना देगी. लेकिन ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के पास भी कोई ब्लूप्रिंट नहीं है. लेकिन ये ऐतिहासिक प्रक्रियाएं हैं. प्लासी तक इसलिए वो पहुंचे क्योंकि व्यापार के साथ राजनीति भी करते थे, मिलिट्री हस्तक्षेप भी करते थे, और डिप्लोमेसी भी करते थे, जहाजों का भी प्रयोग करते थे, नाविकों का भी प्रयोग करते थे, गन्स का भी प्रयोग करते थे. दैट्स व्हाई दे रीच्ड प्लस. That's what brought them to Plassey. And after Plassey, they are again sort of trying to figure out कि यहाँ पे किस तरह से हम अपने आप को स्टेबल करें, किस तरह से स्टेबलाइज करें लोग. एलीट का अभी भी एक बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा है जो which has not reconciled, and they put up a fight, and that leads to, they put up resistance, that leads to the Battle of Buxar 1764, in which the main army is that of the Mughal Subedar of Awadh, Shuja-ud-Dawla, who is also by this time more or less autonomous, but still nominally acknowledges that he is the servant of the Mughal emperor. The Mughal emperor himself is present when the battle is taking place. He has no army by this time. Army Shuja-ud-Dawla ki hai, assisted by the army of Mir Qasim, who had actually been replaced, who had been placed on the Gaddi of Murshidabad by the East India Company itself. तो उसमें इस बैटल ऑफ बक्सर में, इस युद्ध में, East India Company is again, that's a more substantial war, more substantial battle, and they win in this. And then what do they demand? They have managed to gain control over Bengal and Bihar and parts of Odisha. लेकिन वो क्या डिमांड करते हैं? मुगल एम्परर के पास Clive had gone back, then he came back, he was sent back again. And the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam, who has been Mughal Emperor since 1759, he is residing in Allahabad. Buxar se wo Allahabad chala jata hai. Wahan, the Shah Alam is there. That's in Awadh. That's the Awadh territory. And Clive goes to Allahabad. And what does negotiations take place? Shujauddaulah is also there. Shah Alam is there. And do you know what they are negotiating? They are negotiating what leads to the grant of Diwan. We need to ask this question: why was that grant so important? Why were they so keen to get that document which said that the revenues of Bengal will be collected by the East India Company? Why are they interested in document? Because that legitimizes their position. मुगल इंपीरियल हायरार्की में उनका स्टेटस लेजिटिमाइज हो जाता है, और ये युद्ध में जीत के बाद है. बक्सर में शुजाउद्दौला, शाह आलम और मीर कासिम की पराजय के बाद वो डॉक्यूमेंट मांग रहे हैं, बिकॉज दैट लेजिटिमाइजेस देयर प्लेस इन. So to win is one thing, but to gain acceptance, you can't constantly be saying, I will rule by force. Why should you obey me? Because I have superior force. That is not the way in which states power is stabilized, is legitimized. So you need to seek legitimacy. And the Mughal document, which made them sort of servants of the Mughal emperor, which is a status they retained till 1858. I'll maybe conclude with that. We are sort of now running a little short of time. So I'll quickly go through 2 or 3 important things that I want to discuss. And I wanted to, this is the founding movement. I wanted to spend a little time on this. What happens in 1757? What happens in 1764? 65, Grant of Diwani 1765. Textbooks will tell you that Grant of Diwani, बैटल ऑफ बक्सर में हार गए. लेकिन ये इंपॉर्टेंट प्रश्न है कि वो क्यों वो डॉक्यूमेंट चाहते थे, क्यों देयर इज अ फुल दरबार हेल्ड, मुगल दरबार, दैट इज फॉर्मल दरबार में वो डॉक्यूमेंट दिया गया, which was organized in Allahabad, where all the court ceremonial, where all the protocols of the darbar are maintained. The seal that the company has is a seal which says Diwan of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. That's the official seal they carry with them, which they use in their documents. It's there in the British Museum. British Library has that seal in its collection. So this then brings me to 2 or 3 other quick points which I want to make. One is that after the acquisition of empire and territory itself has its own logic. भाई इतना पैसा, इतने resources, इतनी बड़ी territory, which is much, much bigger than England, has been acquired by the company. So company also is answerable back home. Mind you, here in India, it is subservient, it is acknowledged its subservience to the Mughal emperor. That's the servant of the Mughal emperor. Is part of the Mughal imperial hierarchy. But it is also a creature of the charter, which is issued by the queen initially, which gives it that privilege of being the monopoly trader. England में कोई और व्यापार नहीं करेगा between Europe, between Britain and India. It's a monopoly, and that charter keeps on being renewed from time to time. But then, so it is answerable to the various organs of the state in England also, to the parliament, to the royal court, to the British cabinet. Because after all, by 18th century, Britain is a constitutional monarchy. So ultimately, it's parliament and cabinet. So they are answerable to that. So there are people who are now saying that here are people who made so much money, who have plundered Bengal, who have managed to acquire so much wealth. They are coming back to England. And what are they doing? They are buying up seats in parliament. They are undermining British democracy. They are a threat to that democracy. They are bringing back this new wealth. So they are a danger to British society. So let's investigate them. Let's put curbs on them. That is what leads to the initial sort of assertion by the British Parliament of its right to intervene in these political matters of the East India Company. Now, what is the East India Company? And that to understand that, let me just make a reference to one important piece of legislation. 1773, you have the first important piece of legislation enacted by the British Parliament to supervise, to monitor the company and what it is doing in India. 1773 is what is called the Regulating Act. I might also mention this is just the time when they are losing their colonies. They are engaged in a problem, in a serious problem, which will lead to the loss of their colonies in America. तो लोग चिंतित हैं. Political opinion is very worried कि क्या होगा इंडिया में, क्या होगा, यहाँ भी क्या यही प्रॉब्लम्स होंगे. अगर नियंत्रण नहीं होगा ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के एक्टिविटीज पे तो ये भी मिसमैनेज करेंगे और यहाँ भी प्रॉब्लम हो जाएगा. So there's a lot of, so there is new wealth. There is this thing about, these people are buying up seats in parliament. They are corrupting the political system. All these issues are coming up in Britain. And eventually that leads to the initial inquiries, initial intervention by the British Parliament. And the assertion कि हमको ये अधिकार है कि अब ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी क्या कर रही है इंडिया में, उसके ऊपर हम निगरानी करें. 1773, that leads to the Regulating Act. Any book will tell you, even these days, you do a Google search, there's so many coaching centers, they'll give you all the details of what the Regulating Act is. But what I just want to emphasize is the first time the British Parliament asserts its right. But it creates no mechanism for doing that, for monitoring regularly. That is something that is they do by another act which comes in 1784, where they establish a permanent mechanism. And I just want to say something about that before I sort of come to one or two other points which I want to quickly make while summing up. This is that the East India Company's how is the, so we must remember, and that's why I wanted to use this specific sort of emphasize the East India Company. What is the East India Company? The East India Company is a company in which there are shareholders. Shareholders whose main interest is कि हमारे शेयर का दाम जो है वो बढ़ना चाहिए, हमें डिविडेंड मिलना चाहिए, हमने अगर उसमें पैसा लगाया है उस पैसे का रिटर्न आना चाहिए. That is all they are interested in. What is happening in India is of no concern to them. It becomes their concern only when they are told, no, the value of your share is going down. Ultimately, companies are answerable to whom? Not to the Indian people. Not even to the British. People is answerable to their shareholders. Shareholders whose interest is that शेयर की वैल्यू रहनी चाहिए और उसका हमें रिटर्न मिलते रहना चाहिए. After 1757, in fact, gradually, East India Company share prices are going up. There are ups and downs, of course, but going up, and it's a safe investment. So that's their interest. Let's not forget this. Ultimately, that is, and unka, what is the body in which these shareholders discuss these matters? It's in what is called the Court of Proprietors. It's something like what companies have the annual general body meeting. तो वहां सबसे पहला आइटम क्या होगा? बैलेंस शीट ही होगा ना. इंडिया में हम कैसा शासन कर रहे हैं, दैट्स नॉट गोइंग टू बी समथिंग दैट्स ऑफ ग्रेट कंसर्न. Is the balance sheet that is important. And this court of proprietors is what elects. This is the court of the, or what is known as the general court, which has a which then elects the directors. उनकी terminology में court of directors, or what would be today be a board of directors, but it is a little sort of slightly more sort of powerful kind of body. So the court of directors, the court of proprietors, court of directors. Court of directors is elected by the court of proprietors. Now, by the time you come to the mid 18th century, the court of proprietors is not elected by all members. There is a qualification in terms of the value of your share. So only those who have shares of the value of 500 pounds and above. 500 pounds in England is a big amount at this time. Please remember this. 500 पाउंड्स का शेयर वैल्यू है तो आप इलेक्शन में वोट दे सकते हैं, नहीं तो नहीं दे सकते. अटेंड कर सकते हैं जनरल कोर्ट, सुन सकते हैं क्या हो रहा है, उसमें कुछ पार्टिसिपेट भी कर सकते हैं, लेकिन वोट नहीं कर सकते. कोर्ट ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स, वंस इट इज इलेक्टेड, दे आर a body which then administers all aspects of the country. In other words, this is the body which ultimately administers, governs India, and it continued to govern till 1858. What 1784 Act did was to create a mechanism called the Board of Control, which was created by the British Parliament, which comprised two important ministers also. And it was a 6-member body which had the right to examine all correspondence, every aspect of the company's functioning, and also had a right to intervene. And this is what brings me to another crucial point, which I want to submit before you for your consideration. This board of control had no independent secretariat, no independent sort of infrastructure for keeping records or so on. Everything is maintained in the company's headquarters, which is located in a place called Leadenhall Street. Leadenhall Street में सब कुछ है. 1600 से पूरा जो डॉक्यूमेंटेशन है, आर्काइव्स है, मिनट्स है, सब कुछ वहां रखा है रिकॉर्ड. और उस रिकॉर्ड को डायरेक्टर्स भी नहीं जानते जो इलेक्ट होते हैं. तो कौन जानता है? जो उनका क्लेरिकल एस्टैब्लिशमेंट है. सो अल्टीमेटली, and by the way, this clerical establishment became a high, powerful body. और एक बहुत वेल नोन 2 नाम है उसमें. James Mill was employed in that clerical establishment. I call it clerical establishment because it has a large clerical staff, but then they are under what is known as the examiner of correspondence. What is this examiner of correspondence doing? The examiner of correspondence and the office of the examiner of the correspondence is responsible for sorting out the huge amount of documentation that is received from India in every ship. Every matter, small, minor, trivial, has to be reported back. Sanction होगा, approve होगा तो ठीक है, नहीं होगा तो even if it is orders come 10 months late, it has to be undone. So everything has to be reported to the court of directors, and the court of directors to rely ultimately on this clerical establishment, the office of the examiner of correspondence. which then prepare, as you know, they categorize, they then sort out the files, they then prepare for every matter, they prepare the background note. You know how government bureaucracies function. You have to put up, file put up ki jati hai. This is the term put up. Put up means there has to be some noting, background, rules, regulation are to be cited. And that is then discussed by the court of directors. And the court of directors then might send it off to the board of control, which has no independent establishment. They have to rely greatly on the establishment of the East India Company, the court of directors, its clerical establishment, its clerical staff, the staff of the examiner's office, people like James Mill, subsequently his son John Stuart Mill. So these are the people who are going to then provide the background to determining policy. And the court of directors remains in place till 1858, even after 1813. 1813 May, East India Company's charter, when it is renewed, it loses its monopoly of trade with India, then monopoly of trade with China, but it still continues to govern India. बोर्ड ऑफ कंट्रोल से ऑर्डर नहीं आता है, गवर्नर जनरल का अपॉइंटमेंट बाय कंसल्टेशन, गवर्नमेंट, कैबिनेट, रॉयल कोर्ट, वो सब उसमें होते हैं, लेकिन अल्टीमेटली वोट जो अल्टीमेटली इट हैज टू बी अप्रूव्ड बाय द कोर्ट ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स. वो लेटर इशू करते हैं, वहां पे जाके ओथ लेना पड़ता है. दे पे द सैलरी. He is a salaried employee of the East India Company, the Governor General. And that remains in place till 1858. When the Crown takes over, all this establishment is then dismantled and transferred, a large part of it transferred to what became the office of the Secretary of State for India. Secretary of State mean का मतलब है high level minister. And the company's role comes to an end in governing the Indian Empire, and the empire that it has played an important role in creating. The company itself continues to be in existence till 1874 to keep on maintaining its account books. उसके shareholders तो अभी है ना, वो सब wind up होना है काम, उसके assets का transfer है, वो सब है, कई चीजें और होनी है. कंपनी इतनी पुरानी कंपनी ऐसे थोड़ी wind up हो जाती है, उसमें 20 साल लग जाते हैं. And 1874, eventually, it closes down. That brings to an end the story of the East India Company. Thank you. We'll stop here. And then if there are questions, there are other aspects we can talk.
Thank you so much, Amar sir, for this very, very interesting and lively lecture, because today we talked about a lot of things from 1600 to gradually acquiring the territorial control and political power, especially what happens after Battle of Plassey in 1757. So there was one question last time, I think it was by Vidya, if I'm not mistaken, on whether the company remained in India, as in they were doing business with India even after the crown took over. You have already answered that question now.
No, let
Bec-
me just clarify that
yeah.
the company actually, its business activities had more or less come to an end by the end of the 18th century. In fact, by the beginning of the 19th century, 1813 के बाद जो चार्टर था जिसमें उनका जो मोनोपोली थी ऑफ ट्रेड विद इंडिया, that came to an end. They were actually in the business of selling off a lot of their property in London. Please remember, 200 साल में 200 सवा 200 साल में company became a big landowner in England. It had docks, it had warehouses, it had offices, it had, so sort of they were actually disposing of a lot of that, but they retained one important monopoly, which was the monopoly of the China trade. And why was that important? क्योंकि they controlled it was a monopoly which made them the monopoly supplier of tea to England. Now, please remember that tea itself is a taste which has been acquired during the course of the latter half of the 18th century. And there's an important connection there. Tea became a beverage of mass consumption in Britain almost at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. And not tea by itself. What was important in that tea was not the tea, but the tea with sugar. And where is that sugar coming from? The sugar is coming from, again, British colonies in the West Indies. And this sugar is being produced by slave labor. Coming, slaves brought through the Atlantic slave trade from Africa. Ultimately, these slaves are also going to provide the textile industry in England with raw cotton from the southern states of America. But अभी हम चाय की बात कर रहे हैं, तो tea itself is a newly acquired taste. But it becomes a beverage of mass consumption because workers को it provides cheap calories, empty calories. So Chinese tea, so as this market expands, and actually, historians who worked on the history of tea, they tell us that it's actually in the period roughly from the 1760s, 1770s that tea became sort of beverage of mass consumption. What really made this, expanded the market was what is the Commutation Act of 1784. 1784 में the British Prime Minister at that time, William Pitt, he drastically reduced the import duties on tea, which made it possible for this to be consumed by ordinary people, by by workers. So that made this so important by the end of the century. As the Industrial Revolution develops, this becomes a beverage, a cheap sort of beverage, cheap thing to have. So for the East India Company, the expanding business of tea remained very important. That's why even after the Indian monopoly was abolished, they tried to retain control over the China monopoly because they were major suppliers of that. But other than that, they are gradually dismantling all their warehouses and so on. And after 1833, जब उनका trade वो खत्म हो जाता है, तो that sort of they have to dispose of a lot of their property, and they are no longer actually they shed some of their staff. They are no longer engaged in commercial activities in the sense that they were earlier.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll just end the YouTube live stream so that we can have a chat here on Zoom. So those who are watching us on YouTube, thank you so much. If you have any question for Professor Farooqui, you can email us on karwanheritage@gmail.com. And if you really want to be part of these Zoom calls, you have to be member of the Beyond the Myth workshop, which will happen next year. So you'll have to wait 1 year for the next Zoom session like this. And so we'll go for the privileges of those who have become members of the Beyond the Myth family. Thank you so much, everybody who joined us on YouTube. And now